Well, we are right in the middle of our series on the life of David. I'll just backtrack a little bit to refresh your mind. The first week we talked about the story of David and Goliath. Many of us have learned this story in Sunday school as kids. Maybe many of you have heard this story over and over again. But this is where we saw that David was solely reliant on God. He was young, probably only about 15 years old, had no fear as a typical 15-year-old boy. But with that no fear, he knew who God was. He knew who God is, and he was sure to follow him. He knew that it wasn't God who was winning the battle either. He knew that that was all God. God was the one totally in control. Then last week was this quite a bit different story, actually. Before David was king, he's in his early 20s or so. He makes all sorts of bad decisions. And we know what happens when you make bad decisions, right? They start to take you down, right? And when they start to take you down, what do? You just keep making more and more and more bad decisions, which usually end up just making everything worse. And that's exactly what David did. And last week I left off on a little bit of a cliffhanger, if you would. Innocent people were dying. 85 priests, their entire village, their families, their children, their babies, their wives, every single one of them were killed senselessly. David is feeling guilty because David realized that that was because of him and the bad decisions that he made. There were consequences that came along with that, and that was one of them. Things were really bad, and they were bad because David, instead of turning to God, in fact, actually ignored God. He had a time when God showed him that sword of Goliath, that spear, and said, remember just a few short years ago, how I did this for you. But David ignored all of that, went off and did things his own way, literally took matters into his own hands. So in today's episode, we are right on the heels of when David had been making these bad decisions after bad decision. And now he's on the verge of making another bad decision, which is just getting worse. And that's what typically happens. Again, when we're on a downward spiral, we just make more and more. But fortunately for David, there's a happy ending to this story. At the very last minute, he is saved from the bad decision he's about to make. So before I get into all that, let me ask you this. Everybody probably knows what the golden rule is. Everybody know what the golden rule is? Okay? Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. That's right. That's the golden rule. Many of us learn this as kids. Many of us learn this in school. So a lot of times we don't even think and realize this is actually a Bible thing right here, okay? This is more God's standards than anything. Do unto others as you would have others do unto you. So in other words, however you want to be treated, that's how you treat other people, right? If you want to be treated kindly, then you treat other people kindly. Now that's all fine and dandy, until somebody mistreats us. When it comes back on us, then we want to change that rule. Then we want to make it say, do unto others as others have done unto you. You see how that starts to twist it around? Okay? So if somebody gets to hurt you, then you should be able to get to hurt them, right? And then there's this whole complicated side of things. When you've been mistreated by somebody, but yet you can't quite get to them. You can't get back with them, right? You can't mistreat them. So you take your anger or whatever else is going on inside of you, and you just throw it out and purposely put it on somebody else who had nothing to do with the situation to begin with, right? You're not throwing it back on the person who maybe should have had it. Instead, now you're putting it on whoever else you can because it's just there and you can. And they're lost and wondering why in the world you're treating them like this. You see, the truth is when you feel powerless in one relationship or in one environment, oftentimes we compensate it in another then. I can't take it out on that person, so take it out on them. And if we ever get to the point where we want to uncomplicate all of those things, then often it's too late. It's like getting something brand new and you take everything out of the box and you mess it all up. You never get it back in the box the same way, right? You don't ever get to actually make it go back to the way it was originally. Now, you probably know where I'm going with this, right? Because, we learned this hopefully in elementary school. The problem with getting back at people or the problem with getting even with somebody is that you're even with somebody you don't even like, right? Am I right? Why would you want to be like somebody that you don't even like? Why would you want to be even with somebody that you don't even like or that is doing something so wrong? Because when you get even, you're acting just like them. I have told my son and my stepsons this over and over and over again. Why be just as even as they are? Now that brings me back into the part here, back into David's story. And real quick, let me just set the scene here for you. So the story takes place about 1000 BC, so it's about 3,000 years ago, all right? So this is quite some time. It's about 1,000 years before Jesus' time. There's so much extraordinary detail in this story of David that, man, I really, really encourage you. I really want you to dive into this story. I've read this story before, and when I go back in, I find more things, and I see more details and more things that are just educating me on what really happened. So there's so much that goes on, and I'm not going to get through it all in this series. So please go in and read the story for yourself. Now, David steps onto the scene as a warrior. Again, he's about 15 years old. He slays the giant, right? He kills the giant, immediately becomes this legend. Everybody knows his name. He's popular all throughout not just Israel, but the towns and countries around him. Then something horrible happens that we saw last week. He becomes a fugitive because King Saul is extremely jealous of David. See, David ended up marrying one of his daughters. David ended up becoming best friends with his son Jonathan, which had this beautiful friendship and love between them, right? And then he decides, okay, it's not so good that this guy's in my family, so let me go ahead and send him out on some really wild missions where he'll likely be killed. Every time what happens? He comes back. David was a huge success every single time. Saul was like, I can't handle it. This is enough. He is extremely jealous of him. He runs him out of the country, and David is now considered a fugitive on the run. Now, if you may remember last week, I mentioned this part, that David had escaped to a cave, right? So he goes off to this cave where he's kind of hiding out, living in a cave, living off the land, and his brothers come to meet him. I'm not exactly sure how they found him. Somewhere along the line, they found him. They end up coming along, some other family members come along, and eventually this gets really, really interesting because it starts with about 400 men right off the bat, then it goes to about 600 men. All these men come piling into, this must have been one huge cave. They all come into this cave. They all come to David. And why? Because they're fugitives as well. They're outcast. And they're thinking their best bet, their best bet in life is to support David to become king. So maybe that means that some of these are unjustly fugitives. I don't know. Or maybe they just realize that David's going to be a better king and David's going to certainly make justice with some of this. Who knows? But before we know it, 600 men are following David. He is now captain over 600 men. Now, there's a lot in the story, and I'll touch a little bit on this one later, but just to give you an idea, I'm going to skip past this story where they're in this cave, right, living in this cave, and King Saul, he meanwhile is still chasing David. He's trying to find David, and he gets to this cave where David is. You remember the story. It's a little too personal if you ask me. But he goes into the cave to relieve himself. We'll just leave it right there. So David is close enough to him that he cuts a little bit off of his robe, right? He could have killed him, but he just cuts a little bit off his robe just to prove to Saul, hey, I could have killed you, but I know better than that because I know who God put in place as a king, even if you are a terrible king. God still put you in that place, and I respect that, right? So he's trying to do what's right. He's trying to do what's right, but yet he does not feel welcome in his own country. David is trying to stay out of trouble, and so here we are with this story, and it begins in 1 Samuel 25. A certain man in Maon who had property there at Carmel was very wealthy. He had 1,000 goats and 3,000 sheep, which he was shearing in Carmel. His name was Nabal, and his wife's name was Abigail. She was an intelligent and beautiful woman, but her husband was surly and mean in his dealings. He was a Calebite. So basically, he's harsh. He's mean. Nobody likes him, right? He's one of those kind of people that nobody can ever talk to. You can never get along with this guy. He's mean. He's nasty. In fact, his name means full, which we'll read a little bit more here in just a moment. But his name means full, and he truly lives out that name. While David was in the wilderness, he heard that Nabal was shearing sheep. So he sent 10 young men and said to them, go up to Nabal at Carmel, and meet him in my name. Say to him, long life to you, good health to you and to your household, and good health to all that is yours. Now, David, let's not forget, was a shepherd himself. He knew very well that this was a sheep shearing time, right? This was the time of the year to have that done. Now, in this season, when herdsmen sheared their sheep, this was like their big paycheck for the year. This was the one time that they got their big paycheck. And many of you in this room are farmers in one form or another, and you know exactly how that feels when you get that one big paycheck, right? All of a sudden you feel like you're pretty wealthy for a while. And this is a person, Nabal, this is a person who found out exactly how wealthy he really was, more than he realized that he was going to be. So this was generally a very festive kind of time. The season's over. All the hard work there is done. We can celebrate. Everybody's got their big paychecks. Everybody's feeling a little more generous. And David sends this message up to Nabal. So essentially what David was saying was, look, Now I hear, let's read on here a little bit further. I hear that it is sheep shearing time. When your shepherds were with us, we did not mistreat them, and the whole time they were at Carmel, nothing of theirs was missing. Okay, so David's basically pointing out here that he was out in the field surrounding these herdsmen. He saw them, he watched after them, he didn't let any of his men take a single sheep, take a single lamb, do anything harm to any shepherd or anybody else, right? David didn't let any of that kind of stuff happen, which means to me, how big of fugitives were these guys if they made sure to take care of these guys and not let anything happen? So what David was actually saying was that part of the reason you have such a profit now, Nabal, part of the reason you have such a profit and you're so wealthy is because we protected you. We didn't steal from you. We took care of you. We kept a close eye on you just because we were there, just because we could, right? And no one else came along and bothered you. No one else came along and stole your sheep because we were there. And it goes on. David says, ask your own servants, and they will tell you, not David, his servants say this. Therefore, be favorable towards my men, since we come to a festive time. Please give your servants and your son David whatever you can find for them. So he's saying your servants, your son David, because basically David is saying, I'm trying to be a servant to you. We helped you, we were kind to you. Please help us in return. Since we were good to you, be good to us. When David's men arrived, they gave Nabal this message in David's name, then they waited. And I have to wonder why that last little sentence, then they waited, is in there. Probably means because Nabal is ignorant, he's rude, and he's just Ken. And he's probably busy thinking up some kind of smart comment, some kind of smart answer that's not going to be so nice, right? Nabal answered David's servants, who is this David? Who is the son of Jesse? Many servants are breaking away from their masters these days. He knows exactly who David is. When he says this last line that many servants are breaking away from their masters these days, he knows that David has broke away from his master, the king Saul. He knows what's going on. Everybody knows David. Everybody knows the legend, knows the story, and you can't tell me word didn't travel just as fast as our social media back then. I was probably even faster, right? They knew what was going on. This just proves that he does. I think he's just playing dumb or even just being mean because he didn't ask for David's protection, but yet David was kind to him. So in his mind, he doesn't think he owes David anything. Why should I take my bread and water and meat I have slaughtered for my shearers and give to men coming from who knows where? Okay, tells you even more that he knows who David is. He knows that his men are fugitives. He knows who knows where they came from. Who knows what kind of guys these are, right? David's men turned around and went back. When they arrived, they reported every word. David said to his men, each of you, strap on your sword. So they did, and David strapped on his as well. About 400 men went up with David, while 200 stayed with the supplies. Do you know that self-control is like a muscle, and you can wear it out, right? Patience is too. These virtues are like muscles where we have to exercise them. We have to work hard to kind of keep that balance, keep them strong, keep them exercised, or they can wear out. I think that's what's happening here. The best that I can tell from this story is that David's self-control muscle is worn out. His patience are worn out, and he is just fed up. Now, I'm reading a little bit between the lines here. This is not actually in the scripture, but he's been running now for several years. He's having to live off the land when he should be living very comfortably. He is the king's son-in-law. He should be in a palace. He should be with his wife. He should be living very comfortably, and he's living in a dirty, damp, dark cave, living off the earth. He's tried to do the right thing. When he did the wrong thing, he repented. He absolutely, full-heartedly repented. He's not trying to side with the enemies of Israel, but at the same time, Israel won't embrace who David is, this hero that they know that he is. He's tired and he's worn out. Now, he's doing what we all tend to do from time to time. He's pointing his frustration at somebody else who certainly doesn't deserve it. He's built up so much stuff, this is his last straw. Come on, guys, strap on your sword. Let's go. Let's go. Now we find out a little later in this text that David starts to do something else that we all do. He starts to journey as he's on his way to Nabal, He starts to think, because, Nabal's just been so unkind, he's unjust, so he considers it. He begins to do what we all do. He begins to justify exactly what he's about to do. See, he's not so sure that he really should be strapping on his sword and taking 400 men to go kill Nabal and all of the men of his land. He's not so sure he should be doing that, right? And so he's questioning it, which is exactly what we do. We're not so sure that we really should be doing what we are about to do. So we start to say, you know what? It's okay. It's okay. And we start to convince ourselves that it's okay and that we're doing the right thing. Fortunately, this is about to be where the story takes a nice turn, thank the Lord. One of the servants, who would have been one of Nabal's servants, told Abigail, Nabal's wife, David sent messengers from the wilderness to give our master his greetings, but he hurled insults at them. Okay, so first off, that means his servant was there. He heard this firsthand. He knew exactly what David's men said. He knew exactly what Nabal said. And he decided that Nabal's wife needed to know what was going on. Who really runs the house here, huh? No, I'm just kidding. But he decided Nabal's wife is the last chance to probably save all of our necks. She needs to know what's going on. And he's like, look, what David's men said is absolutely true. These men were good to us. They did not mistreat us. And the whole time we were there, this is a servant who was there in the fields with the sheep. We were out in the fields near them. Nothing was missing. Night and day, they were a wall around us. The whole time we were herding our sheep near them. Now think it over and see what you can do, because disaster is hanging over our master and his whole household. He is such a wicked man that no one can talk to him. Abigail acted quickly. She took 200 loaves of bread, 2 skins of wine, 5 dressed sheep, 5 measures of roasted grain, which is about 60 pounds, 100 cakes of raisins, and 200 cakes of pressed figs, and loaded them on the donkey. And then she told her servants, go ahead, I'll follow you. But this is where she's a smart woman. She did not tell her husband, Nabal. She didn't tell him a thing. I don't know how she did it. She loaded up all of this stuff, left their palace, left their city, and took all this stuff out to David. She was a smart woman. There's so much detail, and I, look at this and I think, okay, well, so she took all this stuff, whatever. But this just goes to show how much work and how much effort she was putting into this. So all this detail, this is just wonderful, wonderful information. Again, I'm encouraging you, please read your Bible. But anyways, as she came riding her donkey into a mountain ravine, there were David and his men descending toward her, and she met them. Now, you've got to picture this, okay? We can't read too fast through this because I really want you to picture this. David and 400 of his men, that's a lot of people following him, right? They're snaking their way down through the ravine. This is a ravine where it's very nourishable. It's very, what's the word I'm looking for? I don't know. It's just very great and beautiful because this is where they're shearing their sheep. This is where the sheep are eating the grass and so forth. So they're snaking their way down through the valley. And Abigail comes riding on her donkey. She sees the men in this line. She sees all these men coming at her village. Now, this is where David knows that what he's about to do is not quite right, and he's talking to himself, and he's trying to talk himself into this. He's had a long journey, and he's about to lose it on innocent people. David had just said, it's been useless, all my watching over these fellows' property in the wilderness, so that nothing of his was missing. He has paid me back evil for good. May God deal with David, be it ever so severely, if by morning I leave alive one male of all who belong to him. Do you hear how he's trying to say this is okay? He's trying to convince himself. May God deal with David. So he's saying this has to be right. If it's not right, then may God deal with me. May God deal with me. Now this next part is so rich. I want to point out a few key details here because these are ones that we can pass over pretty quickly if we read it too fast. But when Abigail saw David, she quickly got off her donkey and bowed down before him with her face to the ground. This is not normal. This is not normal. He's not king. He's a fugitive. He's a bad guy, right? He's a bad guy who you shouldn't be talking to, who you shouldn't be associating with. King Saul's after him. Him and his men are eventually going to get him. They're probably going to kill him, and you'll never hear David's name again. This is a fugitive. But yet this is a woman who is married to a very influential, wealthy man. And she's bowing down to David. And this totally catches David off guard. He's just like, whoa, what do I do with this? What is going on here, right? She begins to treat David as if he's already the man that she hopes he will be one day. Because she too knows who David is. She's hoping he's going to be the king. You think people weren't talking? People didn't realize that God was with him and all the things God was doing through him? They knew. They knew. And so she's hoping he's going to be king. And Abigail is so smart. She knows who David is, and she knows that this is not in him. And so she's trying to convince him that he's better than this. If she speaks potential to David, looking past what he already did, looking past what he's about to do, he's very likely to change his mind. Now, this is not manipulation. This is not just trying to get her way. She's actually trying to help him see the real potential that he has. I mean, we do this with our kids, right? This works really well with our kids. In fact, this works really well with our husbands too, just to say that, works well for me, right? But overall, she is not dumb. She is very, very smart here. She fell at his feet and said, "Pardon your servant, my lord, and let me speak to you. Hear what your servant has to say." Now, she's not his servant, okay, but she's being submissive. "Please pay no attention, my lord, to that wicked man Nabal. He is just like his name. His name means fool, and folly goes with him. And as for me, your servant, I did not see the men my Lord sent. And now, my lord, as surely as the Lord your God lives, and as you live," this is kind of like some Jedi mind trick, if you would. Watch what she does here. "Since the Lord has kept you from bloodshed and from avenging yourself with your own hands, may your enemies and all who are intent on harming my Lord be like Nabal." Be a fool, right? May they all be like a fool. "And let this gift, which your servant has brought to my Lord, be given to the men who follow you." Okay, she's looking at all these guys. She's down on her hands and knees. She's looking up at David. She's looking up at all these guys who are chomping at the bit, ready to slaughter somebody, right? "Since the Lord has kept you from bloodshed," is what she says. Has he kept him from bloodshed just yet? Well, she's saying the Lord is going to keep you from bloodshed, isn't she? Basically, you're not going to do what you're planning to do, David, because I know you're better than that. And she gives him credit for being a better man than he actually is right in this moment. This is so powerful. She says, "Please forgive your servant's presumption. The Lord your God will certainly make a lasting dynasty for my Lord." So now she's speaking into his future, not just in the next few minutes, but way into his future. David, God is up to something in you. David, God has a plan for you. David, God has made you special for something so much more than this. And here's why. Because you fight the Lord's battles, and no wrongdoing will be found in you as long as you live. You're a good man, David. You're better than this. Even though someone is pursuing you to take your life, the life of my Lord will be bound securely in the bundle of the living by the Lord your God. But the lives of your enemies will be hurled away as from the pocket of a sling. Here's where I want to take just a moment and explain two words in here. This bundle of the living, okay, this bundle, sometimes it's called a treasure pouch in some versions. This is something that's much more like a wallet or a purse, all right? And so you put something valuable in there, usually money, and you put it in this little pouch or this purse, you wrap it up with cord, and you tuck it into your belt where it's nice and safe, right? It can't fall out, nobody can get it, it's nice and safe. So essentially, she's saying, even though somebody is trying to steal your life, like trying to steal a coin from someone, your life is tucked away, safe, in God's wallet. Your life is secure. Your life is buried, if you would, in the bottom of a woman's pocketbook. And we all know, in the bottom of our pocketbooks, you're not finding anything. So if it's down tucked in there, you're safe, David, right? Now she's even more brilliant than that. She goes even further. She takes David back to the moment when he was that 15-year-old boy, solely dependent on God. Just look at the imagery. "But the lives of your enemies will be hurled away from the pocket of a sling." Okay, a slingshot is what she's talking about, right? It's like all of a sudden he's back in that moment when he completely depended on God, when he didn't take matters into his own hands, when he asked God first what he should be doing. Now in this next section, she leans even more into his future, and maybe for some of you this is the whole point of the message. In this next section, she essentially asked a very powerful question. What story do you want to tell when there's nothing left but a story to tell? David, what story do you want to tell? When you look back on this incident, what story do you want to tell about this very moment in time? When the Lord has fulfilled for my Lord every good thing he promised concerning him and has appointed him ruler over Israel, David as king, my Lord will not have on his conscience the staggering burden of needless bloodshed or having avenged himself. And when the Lord your God has brought my Lord success, remember your servant. Remember me, Abigail. Remember me. In other words, one day when you're king, you will not need to have this guilt over your head, David, because you know this is wrong. What you do in this moment is going to be a permanent part of your story. And I'm believing, Abigail says, I'm believing that you're going to change your mind because you don't want this to be a part of who you are. And suddenly David does. He comes to his senses, right? His emotional temper starts to drop. He starts to calm down, and he sees things in a whole new light. David said to Abigail, praise be to the Lord. Right off the bat, I love it. Praise be to the Lord, the God of Israel, who has sent you to meet me. May you be blessed for your good judgment and for keeping me from bloodshed this day and from avenging myself with my own words. Otherwise, if you want to come today, if you want to come right here, right now, if you went and done all that you did and everything that you said, as surely as the Lord, the God of Israel lives, who has kept me from harming you, if you had not come quickly to meet me, not one male belonging to Nabal would have been left alive at daybreak. Then David accepted from her hand what she had brought him and said, go home in peace. I have heard your words and granted your request. He says, look, you had good judgment. You had good judgment. I didn't. And I've realized that now. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you for sending all of that food first. Thank you for sending your servants and for just setting up the scene to start with. Thank you so much for getting off that donkey. You bowed down, made me throw off a little bit, not quite understand what you were doing, but thank you. Thank you for convincing me. Praise be to God for sending you, because he knew better. He knew better. Now, Abigail, I just can't say it enough. She is such a smart woman. Look what happens next. I'm telling you, it gets even better. You've got to read your Bible. When Abigail went to Nabal, he was in the house holding a banquet like that of a king. He was in high spirits and very drunk, okay? So it's the end of the season, it's festival, they're happy, they're whatever. I'm not agreeing with what he's doing, but he's in high spirits and he's drunk. So she told him nothing at all until daybreak, okay? Nothing. Then in the morning, when Nabal was sober, his wife told him all these things, and his heart failed him and became like a stone. About 10 days later, the Lord struck Nabal, and he died. When David heard that Nabal was dead, he said, praise be the Lord who has upheld my cause against Nabal for treating me with contempt. He has kept his servant from doing wrong and has brought Nabal's wrongdoing down on his own head. Then David sent word to Abigail, asking her to become his wife. His servants went to Carmel and said to Abigail, David has sent us to you to take you to become his wife. Obviously, David knows she's a smart woman too, right? David sees past just all the smart things that she did. He sees her clear heart and her pure heart for God. And she responded by bowing down with her face to the ground and said, I am your servant, and I am ready to serve you and wash the feet of my Lord's servants. Abigail quickly got on a donkey and, attended by her 5 female servants, went with David's messengers and became his wife, and they lived happily ever after. The end, right? Isn't that great? That's what we all want. We want to hear a happy ending. The end of the story. Well, let me just put this in a little bit of proper context, if I could. She became one of his wives. And let me just state, okay, this is not God's doing. This is a part, again, where David messes up in life. Many of them were doing it back then. There is no happy ending when there's more than one wife. Let's just be clear, right? House is not always going to be so happy when there's more than one wife. In summary, here's what we have. We have 3 characters, we have 3 different responses, but we only have one hero. And I'm not talking about David, right? Nabal, he does what he wants to do. He returns evil for good because David was kind to him without being asked, so he doesn't think that he owes David anything. Now David was about to return evil for evil. He was about to get even with somebody that he definitely did not like, which makes sense, to be honest with you, especially back in this time, which I'll get into in just a little bit. But Abigail, she sees things completely different. She sees things in a totally different perspective, and she returns good for evil. Now again, Nabal, nobody likes him. Nobody wants to be like him. Nobody likes him. And David, he's predictable just because that's what they did back then. But when you read this story, one thing you absolutely can't miss is that Abigail is remarkable. Her response is remarkable. Her judgment is remarkable. Her approach is remarkable. In this whole story, she is remarkable. And there's a sense in which she's way ahead of her own time. You see, during this time in history, the nation of Israel was under a covenant with God. It was known as the Old Covenant. It's found in the Old Testament. So you remember Old Covenant, Old Testament, right? That's where you find all of this. So it's part of the Old Covenant. As part of that covenant, returning evil for evil was okay. You know what I'm talking about? Eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth. When you read the Old Testament law, David's response, which we think is a bit barbaric, right? It's a little bit over the top, when actually that response was normal back then. That was okay, according to the law. His men weren't like, now, David, come on, don't you think you're overreacting a little bit, David? Don't you think we ought to think about this? No, his men were like, sure, yeah, put on our swords, let's go fight, let's go have some fun, right? Because that's just what they did. It's exactly what they did. But Abigail, she was way ahead of her time because she was much more in tune of thinking like the New Testament, like the new covenant that comes in the New Testament when Jesus showed up and turned a whole world, turned everything, including this, completely upside down. In fact, here's the cool thing. Peter, one of the 12 disciples who saw Jesus, right? Who knew Jesus was innocent, who knew Jesus was sinless. He saw Jesus unrightly arrested, unjustly arrested. He saw him unjustly crucified. He was treated just horribly, but he also saw Jesus' response. Never once did Jesus try to get even with anybody who was ever picking at him, who was ever hurting him, or even killed him. So Peter writes these words to Christians in the first century who are also being unjustly treated. And he doesn't go all David on us. He goes all Jesus on us. He says, do not repay evil with evil or insult with insult. On the contrary, repay evil with blessing. Because to this you were called so that you may inherit a blessing. So in other words, when you're mistreated, don't ignore it. Don't just go neutral. But don't let your anger take over either. Don't go all ballistic and all crazy and let your rage just fly on whoever. Instead, go positive. Go blessing. This is what Peter thought, and this is what Abigail did. This is and should be the usual response. Repay evil with blessing because this is what you were called to do. I mean, you think about it in Peter's eyes, he and the disciples, Jesus didn't even have to warn them of what was going to happen. They knew they were going to be mistreated. They saw how Jesus was mistreated. They knew that they too were going to be mistreated, but yet they still said yes to the mission. They still said yes to the mission, and they went out ready to give blessings instead of the evil that they knew was going to come at them. And then Peter does something that I think is pretty cool. He quotes David from 1,000 years before. See, David got in this time where he was in this journaling mode, and he was just writing and writing and writing. He had learned all these things. He's got these new perspectives, and he's trying to put all this down. I'm not sure if it was just for his own self, for his family, but thankfully we still have it today, all these wonderful things that he wrote down. And Peter feels like it's appropriate to quote David, even though back in David's century, back in David's time, it would have been okay to give an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, right? But he sees this a little bit differently now. So Peter says, and he quotes David, "For whoever would love life and see good days must keep their tongue from evil and their lips from deceitful speech. They must turn from evil and do good. They must seek peace and pursue it." So Peter is writing to Christians who are being mistreated specifically because of their faith. And where did Peter get this crazy idea? It wasn't just from David. It was from Jesus. It was from Jesus. Don't return evil for evil, but return good for evil. Respond to evil with a blessing. He got this from Jesus. In fact, he was there the day that Jesus made this famous statement that many of us know and can probably finish the sentence. Jesus said, "You have heard that it was said, love your neighbor and hate your enemy." Love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I tell you, love your enemies, and here's the key, Pray for those who persecute you. Pray for them. Pray for your enemies. This is Jesus turning everything completely upside down. Hate your enemy essentially is in the Old Testament, okay? But not the New Testament. That was David's world. This is Jesus' world now. Jesus is turning it all upside down. He said, no more. Do not return evil for evil. Refuse to respond in the same manner. Refuse to be as even as those other people. And if you're a Christian, refusing to act in that same manner as somebody else who is mistreating you is probably the best thing you could ever do. It's probably the closest thing that you'll ever do to be just like Jesus Christ. So in closing, I have 3 questions for you, and we'll wrap this up here. Do you really want to be even with someone you don't even like? Just think about that. Of course you don't. None of us really want to be even. We don't want to be like those people, so then don't do what they do. It's as simple as that. We as adults know this, but we got to catch ourselves before we're doing it because we just habitually do it. I think our world is a lot like David's world sometimes. Tooth for tooth and eye for an eye, get even. But that's not what Jesus says at all. He says instead, be a little bit better. Actually, be ahead of them. And you know how you get ahead of them? You give them a blessing. When they mistreat you and you want to do the same thing back to them, instead, give them a blessing. Second question, what story do you want to tell when this is nothing other than a story to tell? Forgive me, David's was supposed to be off there. What story do you want to tell when this is nothing other than a story to tell? You know, David's story could have been totally different. Right? He could have went around slaughtering innocent people. He could have been known for that. And finally, when there's only a few people left, they all put their hands up and they're scared and so just make David king. That's not a very likely story. Nobody's really going to do that, right? But David didn't want that to be a part of his story either. And thankfully, God saved him. Thankfully, God sent the right person, the right woman at the right time to go and just, David, stop. You're better than this, right? This is a question that we should all ask. I don't care if you're Christian or you have any religious background or any religion at all. This is a question that every single person ought to ask. Every time we get into an intersection and we got to make a decision, this is the question we should ask. I don't think we really want our story to be, I got even. I just became like the people I don't like, right? That's predictable. And I will tell you this third question, if you're a Christian, you don't really have any choices on this one. What would it look like for you to return good for evil? What would it look like for you to return good for evil? When you think about your ex, or when you think about your ex-employer, or you think about that crazy neighbor that lives next to you, or you think about your prodigal son or daughter, whoever it is that has mistreated you, whoever it is has done something wrong, what would it look like for you to return good for evil to that person? To use Peter's word, what would it look like for you to be a blessing to someone who hurt you or offended you? Not just to ignore them, not just to let it go, but to be proactive and actually do something. You know, to do nothing, that's mercy. I'll give you that, that's good. If you just say, I'm not going to give them what they deserve, that's mercy, that's great. But if you actually go and give them a blessing, if you do to them something wonderful, now you're giving what's called grace. And there's a little bit of a difference, isn't there? Grace is more action-packed. It's you actually doing something. And here's the thing. That's no longer predictable, is it? That's remarkable, just like Abigail. That's remarkable. That sets you apart. And ultimately, for somebody, oftentimes that is the thing that sets you free. Because until you return good for evil, that person who has mistreated you seems to have control over you. And it's a mind game, isn't it? A lot of times it's in our own mind, right? And you know how that person still has control over you? Because you're just like David, sitting on his donkey, heading down into that mountain ravine, just knowing and working and planning exactly what you're going to do to that person, what you're going to say to them, how you're going to get even with them. And if you are doing that, then you are returning evil for evil. You see, the only way to get free sometimes is to proactively do something that is exactly what that person doesn't deserve. It frees you, not them. It frees you. And in the long run, you're really doing exactly what Jesus did, or what our Heavenly Father did, aren't you? God didn't just give us mercy. He didn't just ignore us and say, I'm not going to give them what they deserve. No, he went the next step. He went more than a mile, right? And he gave us Jesus Christ on the cross, who died for our sins, who took our punishment. That's grace. That's action. That's grace. So again, If you want to be like Christ, if you want to be like your Heavenly Father, the best thing you can do is to be proactive and to give a blessing over that person who mistreated you or offended you. Now, I realize it's easy for me just to stand up here and say that, right? But you may be thinking, well, you don't know my ex, you don't know my son, you don't know what I've been through. And you're right, I don't. I get that. But I would never get up here and say this on my own authority, ever. I am in the same life struggles as you are. These are things that I still struggle with and battle with myself. We are all in this together, which is exactly why I have to remind myself as well. I have to remind myself that the Heavenly Father has gone that extra mile and beyond. He has done so much more for us. So my hope is that you will remember that too.